Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Well, this past week we witnessed the terribly tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, the conservative political activist. And the accused assassin, is named Tyler Robinson. And what he told his parents is that apparently one of the motive that he did it was that he said that there was too much evil, and this guy, that is Charlie Kirk, spreads hate. And he told his roommate, who happens to be transgender, and I had enough of his hatred. Some hatred cannot be negotiated out. And you want to keep in mind is that basically what um, Charlie Kirk would do is travel around to college campuses, and he would engage students in debates, and he would defend the historic Christian position very, very forcefully. Um, so basically, what Robinson is saying here is that Kirk was filled with hatred simply because he's talking, advocating historic Christian positions on things like human sexuality. And I think that the uh, assassination demonstrated how deeply divided America is over core values. And I would argue that America is deeply divided today because we departed from the values upon which the nation was founded. Now you ask the question, okay, so what were the values on which the nation was founded? And I think that you probably have the clearest statement of that in the Declaration of Independence. It says that it begins by making a reference to the laws of nature and of nature's God. And then a short while later, it goes on and it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this is a little bit controversial, especially within the context of the British monarchy, because what we were arguing, we borrowed the argument from John Locke, and it basically boils down to the social contract theory, where he tries to argue that the governments are formed by human beings voluntarily to promote the common good. And so therefore they derive, as the Declaration of Independence puts it, these governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Then we argue from that that implies the right to revolution. If the government or political arrangement is no longer satisfying the needs of the people have a right to dissolve it and start a new government. Hence the American Revolution. Now you have to keep in mind, of course, a lot of the big debate that's going on right now has to do about whether or not America is a Christian nation. And it could be argued that, strictly speaking, the answer is no. Um, that basically this is all done during the 18th century, during the Age of Reason. Um, not all of the founding fathers were biblically orthodox Christians. Some were not. Okay, Thomas Jefferson, who actually drafted the Declaration of Independence, was not. And but they put a heavy emphasis on human logic and reason. And so they appealed to it. That's why Jefferson appealed to this idea of natural law, which is basically the idea. Well, first of all, if you back up, that even though it was the Age of Reason in the 18th century, they did take for granted the existence of a supreme being, and the idea that we live in a rationally ordered universe that was created by an irrational, intelligent being. And so this idea of natural law basically argued that God constructed us in such a way that we can use reason and logic to ascertain the proper course of human behavior, which they argued means that you respect each other's equal rights. And it could be argued that it's a little bit hard to see how you can deduce a system of ethics from just simply the fact of human existence, but that was the basic idea behind natural law. And so then they came up with the social contract theory of government. Again, it goes back to John Locke, an English philosopher, political scientist. And Locke tried to argue that human beings once existed in what he called a state of nature, and then they voluntarily joined together to form human governments. And so as a result, that what you're going to see is that because the governments ultimately derive their powers from the people, there's going to be the strong emphasis on human autonomy and freedom, which is where American democracy comes from. Now, that brings us to the current crisis that we're with today. Again, the Declaration of Independence was drafted in the 18th century. It was the age of reason. It appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Modern secularism no longer recognizes the existence of God. And that means that that statement in the Declaration of Independence, the whole argument of the Declaration of Independence, falls flat on its face. And so that raises some very, very serious questions. What makes us equal? Where do human rights come from? What makes them unalienable? And what you wind up arguing, in effect, is that there's no higher law than basically the laws that are put together by human governments. And that creates some real problems. I mean, as we've noted here in prior videos that we've done, you go back and you take a look at American history and the American Civil War. The Constitution specifically recognized the existence of slavery and the right of white Southerners to own slaves. And the United States Supreme Court basically argued that African Americans had no rights which white people were bound to respect. So then you had the abolitionists that basically argued that appealed to a higher law. And then you had William Seward, for example, who at that time, at one point, was a U.S. Senator from New York. And he appealed to the idea of a higher law. Well, according to the modern secularists, there is no higher law. You just have to go to whatever laws there are the laws that are made by your government. And if the Constitution recognizes slavery, there is nothing inherently wrong about slavery. So, and I think one of the problems that you found with the New Left back in the 1960s was that on the one hand, they profess to be fighting for social justice, but they're doing it in a moral vacuum. They refuse to recognize any moral absolutes. So what is the basis for getting rid of Jim Crow laws and segregation? So what it basically boils down to is that once you have rejected the idea of natural law, then that means you're faced with a stark choice. Either the one hand, the conservative Christians are going to wind up having to appeal directly to Scripture and say, look, we are put here by God. The Bible is His words. You go by what He's told us in His Word. Or you argue on the secular side, there are no moral absolutes, and then it could be argued that that results then in social chaos and political tyranny. It's very, very hard to see how a democracy can function if you're not agreed on a certain core of social values like the sanctity of life and the sanctity of marriage. And that's basically where we are today. And I would say, I personally tend to be, and this is where maybe I would disagree a little bit with Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk got heavily involved in politics. He was a political activist. And I think he had a very pessimistic view of the higher education system. But he felt that he could get out there and change people's minds and get on the college campuses, that he could turn things around. I personally tend to have little hope for the immediate future. I think it's too late for American society to turn around. You do have a thoroughly secularized educational system. And then what really concerns me is the breakdown of the family structure. That I sometimes tell people that the real problem at the practical level, leave the moral question aside, the real problem facing American society today isn't so much homosexuals getting married as it is heterosexuals not getting married. People drifting in out of relationships, having children out of wedlock, children growing up in dysfunctional single-parent families. And what I think really concerns me are young men growing up in these fatherless homes, little or no contact with their biological fathers. And it's no wonder that they're being attracted to, the alt-right and kind of a neo-Nazism. They get these warped views of masculinity. And of course, this kind of social and political turmoil will eventually lead to an authoritarian government. If we can't come to an agreement over core values through the democratic process, then it's also inevitably somebody's going to have to impose their will. One side's going to have to impose his will on the other. And that basically means the end of democracy. So then that raises the question, for those of us who are conservative evangelical Christians, how are we supposed to respond to this kind of a thing? And first of all, I think, it's important to keep in mind that we're exhorted in the New Testament not to be conformed to the surrounding world. The world is in a fallen and sinful condition, and it has corrupt and warped values. And as Christians, we're supposed to stand apart from it. And this is where I think I would have a little bit of a reservation with Charlie Kirk, is that he's too closely aligned with Donald Trump. And at one point, he criticized John Piper for criticizing Christians who were voting for Donald Trump. And I know that there were Christians that, like Wayne Grudem, for example, who try to argue that that in an election it comes down to a choice. It's a binary choice. And if you don't vote for Donald Trump, then you're voting for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or whoever he happened to be running against. And that would mean that you're voting for the slaughter of innocent unborn children. And so to save the lives of the unborn children, you have to support Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, it could be argued that Donald Trump is a very, very poor personal example of what the Christian life ought to look like. I think one thing that kind of struck me about the whole thing was that a few months ago, Jim Dobson died, well-known Christian psychologist and counselor. And the whole focus of Jim Dobson's ministry was family life and child rearing. But then he came out and supported Donald Trump. So how can you tell people that in a healthy family, a married couple should stay married together and raise their children together, and then turn right around and vote into office, the highest office in the land, somebody who has been divorced and remarried twice, who not too long ago got convicted on charges of bookkeeping fraud so that he could cover up a relationship that he had with a porn star and cheating on his wife. He's the last example of what we want to say. So when you support somebody like that, what you're saying is that adultery really isn't all that bad, or bookkeeping fraud for that either. So rather, we need to be concerned about the testimony of Christ in the church, and we need to be examples of, Christian, the shining lights of Christian truth, goodness, and love. And I think in some cases that means that you just don't vote for a major party candidate, because it's bound to involve some kind of a compromise with the corrupt values of the world. And I think also we're going to have to be willing to suffer persecution for Christ's sake. And boy, did we ever see that dramatically in the case of Charlie Kirk. That he's like literally a martyr. You figure that the main reason that apparently the main reason why Robinson killed him was because of the stand that he was taking, that Charlie Kirk was taking on things like human sexuality and gender roles, and that's going to stir up hatred on the part of the other side, because they're going to feel defensive. They feel you're engaging in hate speech because you're condemning their lifestyle, and so he wound up giving up his life for it. And we're liable to see more of that kind of thing in the days going forward. But Jesus told us if we're going to follow after him, we have to take up our cross and follow him. And I think all of us as human beings, whether you're professing Christians or not, are going to have to face the fact that we're not going to live forever. Someday, each and every single one of us is going to have to give an account to our Creator for the way that we live. And we're going to stand before him on the day of judgment. And so the real question is, where do you stand with God, your Creator? Look beyond the local political scene and what happens in Washington, and think about eternity and where you stand, what you're going to say when you stand before Almighty God. So thanks for listening, and I hope you take all of that into consideration. Bye now.